In 2019, two crazy friends started off a podcast with one of Scorsese's masterpieces.
In 2020, we bring back 3 brands of whiskey.
This is Goodfellas, The Revisit.
Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with another special bonus episode.
And
we thought we'd try something different. It has been well over 100 episodes since we started this podcast, Brad. We are closing in on 100 movies watched sometime in the near future. I can't believe it's been that many. We have been working our butts off for the last almost 2 years. And I thought it was about time that we go back and look at a movie that we had a little bit of beef with. And, to be honest, Brad, our first season, I feel like we threw some movies in there, or I'll take responsibility. I threw some movies in there that I'm kind of like, man, I wish I had that back. I wish we could look at that movie in season 3, in season 4, instead of way back to start this podcast with.
But then what you realized was, this is our podcast and we can do whatever the heck we want.
Yeah, we're actually just going to review Goodfellas 87 times. We're going to just continue doing it week after week.
Bob, I don't know why our listenership has gone down so much.
Well, so anyway, I thought that there was no better candidate for a revisit, now that we're nearing 100 movies watched, than our very first episode, Goodfellas. This was a movie that I thought everyone on Earth loved, and Brad had never seen before, and I thought, what a nice, simple entryway into doing a podcast. And then we watched it, and I heard Brad's opinion of it, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is not going to go well. And, Brad, it's been like over a year and a half now. We've watched a ton of movies together. I really wanted to get your take going back and revisiting Goodfellas to see if your opinion has changed any.
Bob, I'm not going to lie, man. I came back to Goodfellas with open eyes, a fresh heart, just really excited to get back into it. And I will 100% admit, the opening 30 or 40 minutes of this movie just works. Like, from the start of the film, when you get, Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, and he's talking about being a gangster, all the way through that iconic scene where he's taking Karen through the back entrance, through the kitchen, meeting everybody. I mean, it's just perfect. Karen has that amazing line where she asks him, hey, well, what do you work in? And he goes, construction. And I just love the wording of the line. They don't look like construction to me. Like, she's like, a normal person would have been like, oh, it doesn't feel like you work in construction. But like, she honed in on the people that he was talking to and was like, they don't look like construction to me.
Oh, that's funny. I thought she was talking about his hands and how they're not rough.
Oh, really?
And how she's like, yeah, they don't look like construction to me, in terms of like, you could tell she's like feeling his hand. I thought she was saying, like, it doesn't feel like you work, a hard labor type of job.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you're probably 100% right there. I thought she was looking around at the friends he was talking to.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And saying, like, they don't look like construction to me. They look like a bunch of fat Italians.
Accurate.
But yeah, so I was excited to get back into this movie. Bob, I'm curious, you, at the start of our very first episode, you said that you had watched this movie like 20 to 25 times. So is this the first time you've seen it since we watched it for the podcast, or have you added like another 5 or 10 watches to that number?
No, it is the first time I've seen it since then, Brad, because like I had been muttering under my breath, like every time I'm looking for a movie on my shelf to pull out and watch, and I see Goodfellas, I'm like, I'm going to make that son of a bitch watch that movie with me again one of these days. Like, I have just held off on watching it. So, Brad, we're going to break this down, and while we do it, we are going to bring back a couple brands of whiskey that we've really liked. So, since we're revisiting a movie, we're going to revisit some whiskeys as well. And today we're going to be looking at a new expression from Chattanooga Whiskey, which we tried last season, another new expression from Few Spirits, and we're also going to be talking about OKI Bourbon, which is a whiskey that we have not had on the podcast before, but it's a brand that is being resurrected. And so I thought that it'd be kind of cool to, shoehorn that one in here as well. And so before we get started talking about the movie, Brad, I want to get into trying this Chattanooga 99 rye.
Now, I'm just going to assume with all my whiskey knowledge that the 99 insinuates that this is aged for 99 years. So I'm really expecting a lot out of this, Bob.
This was put into a time capsule when they first founded the city of Chattanooga. No, so this is a 99 proof straight rye malt whiskey. Chattanooga prides themselves on their malting processes. They market their bourbon as a high malt bourbon. And so I'm just going to read the copy right off the bottle here, Brad. It says that Chattanooga whiskey 99 rye is handcrafted in small batches. The rye malt is made from 4 grains, including 3 select specialty malts for a distinctly rich and complex character. And the mash bill on this includes malted rye, yellow corn, caramel malted rye, and caramel malted barley. And so I'm really excited to try this, Brad, because it's not just a rye whiskey in terms of we're just using raw grain rye here. They're malting the rye. They're also using barley, so it might have a little bit of that sort of scotchy, almost savory, saline kind of components to it. I think this is going to be a really interesting whiskey. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this one?
Well, first off, I just have to comment on that beautiful reading voice.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Oh, man,
Thank
God
you.
has gifted you. But secondly, I would say that God has gifted this rye with some amazing complexity. It's honestly a little bit sweeter than some ryes that I've nosed. There's a little bit of vanilla carameliness on it. But in the end, there's that little bit of punch of spice at the back end of the nose that reminds me this isn't just some bourbon we're drinking. It is a rye, and I'm excited to taste it.
Yeah, I'm getting really great fruit notes off of this more than anything, Brad. It's like Granny Smith apple with honey on top of it, and then a little bit of caramel on the back end. But for me, it's much, much fruitier than I thought it would be, which may have something to do with the barley characteristics. Sometimes with blended scotches, we get those sort of green apple notes off of them. So I have no idea where this is going to go flavor-wise, but it's going in a really good direction on the nose here. Let's give it a sip.
Wow, Bob, that is really,
Wow.
really good.
Yeah, dude, this is it takes your palate on a journey. Up front, it's apple. It's just green apple juice. You kick it to the back of your mouth, you get some nice burn on the way back, and then when you swallow, it almost reminds me of a product we had from the Few Company last year, that Cold Cut. There's some really great black coffee notes on this when you go to swallow, and I think that's part of the maltiness that's going on as well. You do get some really great grainy notes, but there's a dark black, almost an espresso flavor to this on the very back end for me. I don't know if you're picking up on that, Brad.
Well, for me, the sweetness at the start is carrying a little bit longer, I think, than it is for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's not necessarily like an espresso bean. It's more of a dark chocolate. Almost like a 90% dark chocolate. So it's not much sweetness, but just enough that it's a beautiful, beautiful finish that I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, Brad, when I first cracked this bottle open, I think it needed a couple weeks to breathe because I immediately tried it. I don't know if you remember, but when we had Chattanooga whiskey, their bourbon last year, the Chattanooga 111 was one of my favorite bourbons we've ever had on this show. It was just like caramel cheesecake. It was so creamy. And I popped this and I was like, please replicate that, And this is not that. And I actually think that it really did take a couple weeks for this to open up on my shelf. But now that it's had a couple weeks to sit and breathe, this is a phenomenal rye. And it's really, really unique, too. It tastes different than any other rye I have on my shelf.
Yeah, it is a little bit creamy. It feels a little bit smoother than some of the other ryes I've ever had. Bob, I am digging this stuff.
Yeah, me too. Well, hopefully this carries over into our discussion of the movie Goodfellas. Brad, we've done a whole episode on Goodfellas, so we're not going to go too in-depth on anything. I guess what I really want to focus on today is, what did you notice on this watch through that you maybe didn't feel like you were trained to look for the first time? What are some things that stuck out to you? Maybe some trickery that Martin Scorsese did with the camera or with cutting or something like that really impressed you this time around that you didn't notice the first time?
Well, Bob, I wanted to start with the opening part of the movie, that first half hour that really just moves well. The camera work is just spot on. because the second 2 hours of the movie, once again, just dragged
Wow. I'm really surprised by
on
this.
and on for me. I just don't feel like Scorsese had a tight enough vision for what he wanted out of this movie.
Wow.
I think if the movie was like an hour and 50 minutes to 2 hours long, you would have a really compelling vision. But you just get lost in the frivolity of the movie that honestly, I was more disappointed with this movie the second watch through than I was with the first.
That's really, well, I can't say I'm shocked because, like the first time around, I didn't know if you were like clearly articulating your point about why you didn't like it so much, but you definitely kept reiterating this idea that you thought it was slow moving. And I just remember thinking like, I don't think it's slow moving. I think it's cut really quickly and it definitely keeps its pace. And I still think that. But I do think that, like you said, Brad, that opening 30 to 45 minutes is really designed to kind of overwhelm the senses. And I think it really comes to its climax when Henry and Karen get married and you kind of see her like spinning around, feeling disoriented by all these people around her. And I think that she really is a great conduit for the audience in that way because Scorsese just bombards us with images of the life. And it really is this almost romanticizing of what it's like to, get sucked into this world of being a gangster. But where I differ from you, Brad, is that I really, on this watch through, I noticed more than ever that this movie really does divide very neatly into 3 acts. And it's when those title cards come up. And the really funny thing is like from Act 1 to Act 2, Scorsese has this really like kind of dirty joke that ends Act 1 where, Henry has made all this money and he's really happy with his wife and his wife asks him for a bunch of money to go shopping. And and that scene ends with, them performing some sexual acts on each other. And it immediately cuts from that, like the high point of them being happy together to the night where Billy Batts shows up at their bar and they kill a made guy. And I think from there on, Act 2 is the beginning of the downward spiral, the cracks in the facade, you starting to see the character of Tommy, Joe Pesci, unraveling. And then after Tommy's death, you get that last act, which is just as quickly edited as the first act, where now Henry is strung out on drugs. He's being chased by helicopters. It's like this crazy, paranoid, schizophrenic ending of a film. I really thought that it worked super well. And I was so impressed at how nicely and how tidy it fit into those 3 categories or those 3 acts this time.
See, the problem for me is almost how quickly edited it is. The way you move through this movie, it feels like you never really know what to pay attention to or what to care about because it's all just kind of happening around you. And as a viewer of this movie, I just feel like I didn't matter at all. That all of these things are just happening. It's all so fast-paced and so fast-cut and so long that you just kind of stop caring about halfway through the movie. And even before that, like you said, Bob, once they get married and they kind of move on from there and they start killing bats and they start killing people over and over and over, I just lose interest in the characters and I don't care about what happens to them anymore. And when I get to the third act of the movie, the first time we reviewed this film, I said that I didn't care for the third act. It felt very strange. This time, it soured on me even more. That dissonance between the first 2 acts and the third act made me dislike the movie even more. And it brought me to a place where I was like, I think Scorsese made a mistake in that third act.
Interesting. So let me ask you this, Brad. And again, no judgment because this podcast has been based on you having not seen a lot of classic films. But like, have you seen any of the Godfather movies?
Yes, I've seen the first Godfather.
Okay, so Godfather 2 picks up, a couple years after Godfather 1 ends, and it goes through the 1950s. And it's kind of all about how the Italian mafia is like losing its stronghold in America. And like a good portion of that movie is about like memory and yearning for days past and how things used to be easier than they are now. And I feel like Goodfellas accomplishes in one movie, in one part of one movie, what it took Godfather 1 and 2 movies to do, which is to show how like in the 1950s when they are at the height of their powers in New York, and into the 60s where, like, you know, they're dabbling in some other stuff, and then into the 70s where drugs really take over, and by the time the movie wraps up, it's 1980, and they're kind of a shadow of what they used to be. I think Scorsese really does a great job of showing through Henry's life and Henry's times how the mafia as a whole kind of started to unravel throughout the decades. And like, I really appreciated how the filmmaking styles of all three of those acts kind of differ in order to tell that story. It really did remind me of when we watched The Aviator, another Scorsese movie, about how we talked about how the cinematography in all three acts of that movie was different to mimic the time period that Howard Hughes was in. I felt like this movie did a very similar thing, but it wasn't just with the visuals, the stylistic elements. It was with the way it was edited, the way it was shot. Like, it completely changed from act to act. I can see how it was disorienting and threw you off balance a little bit, but for me, it worked.
Yeah, and it's just unfortunately a place where outside of giving our opinions on it, I think we're just going to have to disagree. That third act is just so jarring and so different, and suddenly you have these weird characters like Lois, the drug-dealing babysitter that's watching the crippled brother that's suddenly back in the picture after being mentioned once at the start of the movie. It just doesn't really make sense to me. And here's the thing. I don't give a rip about these people. Like, the movie hasn't told me I should care about them. I don't know why they're in my movie. At this point, I don't care about Henry anymore. And so I'm just not interested in what's happening in that third act.
Well, see, I think the funny thing then, Brad, is that I would argue that the first act didn't work as well. Because, like, you've been talking about how well the first act worked. But if the first act did its job, then I feel like you would have cared about these characters more. Are they despicable people? Absolutely. But for instance, when Tommy gets shot in the head at the end of the second act, like, do I sympathize with Tommy? Absolutely not. And I think that whole second act went to show that he was a complete loose cannon, right? But I think that his death goes to show, like, it really put the nail in the coffin, you know, to, I guess, pun intended, on how Henry's world was unraveling around him and how much danger he was really in. Because you don't get a sense of the danger of the world in the first act at all. And so when they start to introduce those elements in the second act with the killing of bats and then the retaliation on Tommy, I felt like, oh, this is not good for Henry. Like, I am invested in Henry getting out of this alive because he is in over his head here.
But see, that's the thing, is when you get into the ending part of the first act and then the entire second act, there's just so much going on that you just kind of lose track of all of the characters, and you don't really care what's happening to them anymore. And by you, I mean me. Right. I stopped caring about Henry. I stopped caring about Jimmy. I stopped caring about everybody in the film. And by the end of it, I'm just kind of like, okay, I don't care. Like, Henry's an asshole. Kill him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't really care if he gets off, if he gets all these other guys in trouble, if he gets witness protection. It just doesn't matter to me anymore because they're not likable characters in any way. And even beyond not being likable characters, I don't care about them. And so, you know, whether or not I like a character doesn't mean that I can't care about what happens to them. By the end of it, I'm just like, I don't really care about anybody. I care about Karen a little bit, but she's so bought into the whole lifestyle that you're kind of like, I guess she might get knocked. I don't, you know, who cares?
Yeah. All right, Brad. Well, it sounds like we are in very different places in terms of how we think the movie has held up after repeated viewings. But let's hit pause for a minute. I want to try this OKI bourbon. Now, this is a brand we have not had on the podcast before, but we do have connections to it in a way. OKI bourbon is a sourced bourbon whiskey. It comes from the MGP distillery in Indiana, and it was originally founded by New Riff Distillery. When I went and talked with Jay Arisman last year, the co-founder of New Riff, he talked about how before New Riff was New Riff, it was basically OKI. They were producing this sourced whiskey called OKI, which stands for Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana. It had become like a cult favorite because they had done such a great job at picking these barrels. And then they kind of morphed that into the story of New Riff. Now, again, I'm being reductionistic. There's a lot more to it than that. I encourage you to read up on the history of OKI. But now the Remus Company has bought the name and the title of OKI. They are starting to produce OKI again. It is, once again, it's a sourced whiskey. They're selecting these barrels by hand. I think they've only released 10 single barrel releases so far, and they sold out almost immediately. People really wanted to try this resurrected brand of OKI bourbon. We were lucky enough to get one sample to split, Brad. This sample comes from barrel number 4, bottle number 1 from that barrel. It is 115.5 proof, and it is 5-year whiskey. I'm super excited to try it. I like a good high proof bourbon. I like MGP bourbon when it's the right stuff. So, Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this OKI?
Yeah, I am getting a little bit of spiciness, not from the, any sort of like rye feel or pumpernickel or anything. It's a little bit alcohol forward. And even after I blow it out of the glass, it still lingers. I can just tell it's going to hit my palate hard. But when I look underneath that, I feel like I have a little bit of cherry cola going on. There's a little bit of oakiness. There's a little bit of vanilla. It's a really interesting whiskey that I can't wait to take a sip of.
So I took a sip already, Brad. I will say on my first nosing of it, you're right. I had this kind of carbonated beverage thing going on. And for me at first, it smelled more like 7-Up or Sprite than cola. And I was like, oh, I really like this. Like, I've never had a lemon lime, carbonated soft drink note on my bourbon before. But that's what it was predominantly for me. And it definitely was alcohol forward. When I took a sip, the alcohol was most present on the tip of my tongue. It was like immediately an alcohol tingle, which was good because I didn't think that it was like a lot of a Kentucky hug on the way down. It definitely didn't try to punch you on the way down at all.
Punch you in the throat.
That's right. I think on the taste, it was more of a cola than a Sprite, but it definitely still had in that wheelhouse of like a syrupy, sweet, soft drink kind of note to it. Brad, I don't know. What are you getting on it?
No, as I drink it, I am more and more affirmed in my cherry cola flavor. It just has that little hint of fruitiness, and not like an apple fruitiness, definitely like a cherry or a pomegranate type of fruit that just really is deep and rich, and just to flat out say it, it's impressive.
Yeah, I like this a lot. And the word that I wrote down, and I'm going to sound snooty when I say this, but I wrote down the word effervescent. And it's because of, I actually think, Brad, that the sensation I get on my tongue when I drink this, it almost tastes carbonated. I don't know how else to explain it. It has that sort of, to go back to our Willy Wonka days, it has like the fizzy lifting drink like sensation to me. It really tasted like I was drinking a cola. And I don't know how they hit on that. I don't know what's going on in these barrels that produces that sensation, but it creates this very light kind of bubbly, like mouthfeel to go along with the high alcohol content. And it really helps cut that alcohol so that it's not a harsh burn. I really like what OKI is doing here.
Yeah, they have an extremely impressive bourbon that they've sent us, and I am just over the moon about it.
I'm excited to see how they can continue this run as well. As they hand select barrels, is it going to be a consistent flavor profile, or is it just going to be kind of like we picked the best of the bunch? I think we still have yet to see what happens as this company gets its feet under it again, but I think it really is a welcome addition to this revisit episode.
But as we get back into Goodfellas, Bob, I'm glad you brought up The Aviator, because I feel like that's another movie I want to revisit now. Maybe we should just start a Scorsese rewatch, because I really want to get back into The Aviator now, because I gave it a 10 out of 10. I wonder if that would hold up as well for me a second time through, because Goodfellas, I don't know if I was just looking for the things I didn't like the first time, but I was really hoping to find something new and different and invigorating. But overall, I think I came out a little cooler on it than I did the first time.
So, Brad, I definitely don't want to be the guy that colors your perception of a movie, especially one that you haven't seen. But I may have mentioned this in our episode 1 on Goodfellas. The complaints that you have about this movie are the same complaints that I have about The Wolf of Wall Street, which is a movie that a lot of people liked and just did not work at all for me. I've tried to watch it probably 5 times now, and I have found that I'm cooler on it every single time I watch it. It is a 3-hour-long movie that mimics in some ways the structure of Goodfellas, the pace of Goodfellas, the sort of antics of Goodfellas, with no stakes. Like there's just nothing undercutting it. There's no sense of danger. And part of that is the point of the story, that the character in that movie, Jordan Belfort, can get away with everything that he's doing. But for me, that didn't make for entertaining watching. And so I'd actually be really interested to see what you thought of that movie, because I think if you have these complaints about Goodfellas, you would have those same complaints tenfold about The Wolf of Wall Street. So maybe we should just start a whole season of Scorsese here and see what we come up with.
I mean, if he has 32 films, we might as well throw them all into a bracket, right?
That's true. So, Brad, before we get out of here, though, we have one more whiskey to try, but I want to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on, the acting in the movie. Did anybody's performance kind of come out at you a little bit more than it did the first time around? Anybody you noticed, particular moments about or anything like that?
I think this time through, I was a little more impressed with De Niro and a little less impressed with Pesci. I think that Joe Pesci is given a caricature of a character that he just hammers home every single time you see him. He's just kind of, oh, there's old, crazy Joe again. He's just doing his thing. And so I really struggle with him throughout the film. Whereas I think De Niro actually pulls out one of his better performances because you see him in a lot of different lights. And I actually really liked him more on the second watch through than I did on the first.
So to your point on Pesci, I'm starting to develop this theory now that I hear you talking, Brad, that I wonder if Pesci's performance, it probably played better in 1990 than it does now. But I think part of that also is that he is like a proto Quentin Tarantino character. Like the way that he talks, the language that he uses, the way that he shoots a guy and then immediately starts making jokes about it. And it gives you as a viewer this really weird sense of there's a dead body. This guy's dangerous. He's unhinged, but also it's very darkly funny. And it reminded me a lot of when they shoot Marvin in Pulp Fiction and it becomes this really dark black comedy. And I kind of wonder we didn't have a Quentin Tarantino movie when this film came out. I wonder if in some ways us, being on the other side of 10 Quentin Tarantino movies now, if we look back on a Joe Pesci character and say yeah, it's not doing it for me, but that's just because we're so used to having characters like this, whereas they didn't have them so much in 1990.
Yeah, and that's part of the issue with reviewing a movie in 2020 is that I can't go back and watch this movie as I don't know, a 25 or 30-year-old in 1990 that could fully appreciate the film. But, here I am in 2020 watching it for the second time going, yeah, Pesci was fine. He did what he was meant to do. I guess for me, it might have been the writers more so that didn't really give you a nuanced character in any way. And I guess I just felt like his path was so predictable that he's just a psychotic killer. And that's all he's meant to be. And he doesn't really bounce off any of the other characters very much. All you see, Ray Liotta do with him is try to slow him down. You just see him bouncing off of Ray Liotta and barreling down the road towards his own destruction. And there's not really any meaningful communication between him and Jimmy and Henry throughout the movie. I think I'm realizing that one of the main problems I have with this movie is that for as much as Henry interacts with other people in this movie, it doesn't feel like they ever actually help him change as a character.
No, but they're not, again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this. I don't think they're designed to. The whole purpose of the life of the family, of the mafia, is to continue to reel him into that life, to create this this codependent ecosystem where there is no escape from it. Yeah, I don't feel like they help him change at all because everyone around him, when they shoot Spider, everyone laughs about it except Henry. I think Henry is held up as this person who's the only one with a conscience amidst people that have no conscience. And so that's what makes the decision for him to turn at the end that much more of a conflict, because he really does love the life, but he can't bring himself to continue doing this stuff that he clearly feels guilty about.
But honestly, if we're talking about changing, I think we need to move into this few whiskey because they are changing the game.
Oh, your segues. I love them so much, Brad.
Dude, they're so good, man.
Are they?
They are. Few whiskey is freaking changing the game when it comes.
Listen, we love Few whiskey around here at this podcast. We are such big fans. Paul Hlutko has given us the hookup on almost all of their releases. We loved their cold cut bourbon last year, which was bourbon that they brought it down to proof using cold brew coffee. Now, what they've done this year is they've done basically the same thing with their rye. We have their Immortal Rye today, and this is their rye whiskey, which has been brought down to proof by using a cold extracted 8 Immortals oolong tea. So 8 Immortals is the name of the brand. They've used their oolong tea to bring this down to proof. Brad, I'm not going to lie. We've both tried this already. I had it with my whiskey sour in that episode a couple weeks ago when I tried it with the Boozy Botanicals Earl Grey syrup. This stuff, phenomenal. I want to talk about it, but I think this might be the best thing they've ever released.
Bob, this stuff is so incredible. I opened up the bottle when it came. I took a whiff, I took a sip, and I said, I think I could just drink this whiskey for the rest of my life and be happy. The black tea flavor that you get on this is just incredible. And the thing is, I like black tea. I'll have a chai tea or an oolong, and it's great. But I also love a peppermint or something fruity. There's a lot of great teas out there, but there's something about this Immortal Rye whiskey that it just feels like a culmination of everything I want from a whiskey. There's a tiny bit of sweetness, but there's all sorts of spice. The black tea has such a prominent note that I am just blown away.
So this is a 93 proof rye whiskey. I will say on the nose, it definitely has that young rye scent to it. You know, if there is one overarching critique, and I don't even know if it's a critique, but it's just something we've noticed in all their products, it always smells young. And in terms of their bourbon, it always tastes young. But Brad and I have gone on record before saying, like, we really enjoy young ryes because they have this completely different character than really well-aged ryes. And so on top of that young rye grain scent, I got a lot of ginger, actual grated ginger, maybe some clove. Like the tea was bringing some really interesting earthy herbal elements to it that you don't typically get with a young rye. And when I drink this, Brad, the funny thing is I don't get a lot of black tea notes on it. And I like black tea, so I was looking for some of those. But what really sticks out for me is a dark chocolate. You know, you were getting that on one of our other whiskeys today. I really get it on this. And for me, it almost reminds me of like a Mexican hot chocolate where you have a little bit of cayenne pepper in it. It's like a spiced, really dark, you know, not even semi-sweet, like 80-90% cocoa chocolate to me. And I think that it is just beautiful. You do get some of those black tea notes kind of like undergirding it all, and a little bit of kind of grassiness, some earthiness as well. But for me, it's like rye whiskey that's been darkened with chocolate, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, Paul is doing just great stuff over there at Few Spirits. And yeah, this whiskey has a lot going for it. For me, I really do get that black tea feel out of it. There's that little bit of spiciness that you get from it that's different than a normal rye whiskey. And I think that's what I love so much is that it's unique, it's interesting. And Bob, like you texted me the other day that we've tried 160 whiskeys for this podcast. And like when you've drank that many whiskeys, I think you do get a little desperate for something that is going to change the game.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to what Paul Hletko is doing over at Few Spirits, he is changing the game when it comes to whiskey. And I think that as they grow as a company, as they have time to age their products more, they're just going to keep on doing wonderful things in the world of whiskey.
Brad, here's the crazy thing. We tried 3 wildly different whiskeys today. I would recommend all 3 of them.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And I would say like the OKI, I wouldn't be quite as like full-throated in my support, but that's not because it's bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just because it's like a really solid, standard, high-proof bourbon. There's nothing to be ashamed of there. But with the Chattanooga Rye and the Few Immortal Rye, they're so experimental and they're so, you know, outside of the bounds of what you normally get with a product like that. I think that when you hit on an experimental run and it really does become a home run, that you support it just that little bit much more. You know, guys, I recommend all 3 of these, but especially that Chattanooga 99 and the Few Immortal. Get both of them if you can find them. They are absolutely spectacular.
Robert Book, are you recommending 2 ryes over a bourbon?
Oh, Brad, it's a special day here in the Book household.
What is happening on the Film and Whiskey podcast?
Well, Brad, I want to get your final opinion on Goodfellas. You know, you talked about Scorsese and how he let you down a little bit here. You've talked about how you did appreciate De Niro. Fun fact, I don't know if you remember this, Brad, but this was the year that De Niro did Goodfellas and Awakenings in the same year. Two vastly different performances. So I'm with you on the Robert De Niro love train here. He's just great in this film. But overall, Brad, where would you land score-wise on Goodfellas now that you've watched it a second time?
Bob, I think that my first time through, I still felt a little nervous and uncertain about myself as a movie reviewer. I mean, this was the first movie that I ever, professionally reviewed, right?
Dude, I lobbed it to you. I gave you you should have knocked this out of the park, Brad.
Yeah.
Everyone loves Goodfellas.
Everyone loves Goodfellas. And I gave it an 8.5. And I remember specifically saying that one of the reasons is because I recognize the historical, importance of this movie. But a year and a half later, I watched this movie again. I feel more experienced as a movie reviewer, as a movie watcher, as somebody who appreciates movies. I think that this movie is really, really good. I think it has a lot going for it. But I really don't think it's as good as people make it out to be. I'm lowering my score to an 8 out of 10, Bob.
Wow. So that means that every time we revisit it, you're just going to continue dropping it a half point, right?
Possibly, yeah. Because apparently you're going to make us revisit it multiple times until I give it a 10.
Until you get it right.
Eventually, I'm just going to give it a 10 to just get you off my back.
The funny thing is, after we've had multiple discussions about this, I started thinking, well, maybe it's not a 10 out of 10. Maybe I could drop it to a 9.5. Maybe Brad has some points. And I think you do have some points. It definitely slows down in the middle. But for me, that wasn't actually a negative. I thought that the pacing was just perfect. I thought they did everything the way that it should have been done to tell the story that needed to be told. And for Scorsese to bring these revolutionary editing techniques to the American mainstream, this movie is now, was then, and will forever be a 10 out of 10. And that is bringing our average to a 9 out of 10, lower than it was a year and a half ago.
As it should be. Bob, I'm honestly just proud of you for not mentioning the name Thelma Schoonmaker a single time in this movie.
Listen, Thelma Schoonmaker, maybe the best editor in the history of American movies. She's fantastic.
I am not saying this in any slight to Thelma.
Don't come for my girl Thelma like that.
Thelma, if you want to come onto the podcast, you come on. I think you do a spectacular job with your movies.
Well, this has been The Revisit. It's our very first one. We looked at the movie Goodfellas, but we'd like to know what should be the next movie that we revisit. We'd like to do at least one of these every season moving forward. So please, if you have a suggestion for a movie that you'd like to see us go back and watch again and maybe update our scores on, reach out to us. You can find us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Film Whiskey.
Or leave us a voicemail. Our number is 216-800-5923. Once again, that number is 216-800-5923. Or leave us a voicemail on our webpage, anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
We will be back on Monday with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.